With nearly 280 million cases by February 2024, Europe has been the continent hardest hit by COVID-19. However, there is a huge difference between the various European countries. The nation with the fewest infections has had 10,500 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, while the one with the most infections has had a staggering 74,400 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. It is very difficult to quantify the exact number of deaths, as different countries have counted deaths in different ways, but it is estimated that the virus has been the cause or co-cause of 2.3 million deaths in Europe. Today we will discover the 10 European nations most affected by the coronavirus, and we will try to make an in-depth report on the impact of COVID-19 in Europe. Welcome to this new video from Amazing Europe. Number 10. Switzerland. This beautiful nation nestled in the Alps has been hit hard by COVID, with 51,400 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. On the 25th of February 2020, the Federal Office of Public Health announced that a 70-year-old man from Ticino had tested positive for coronavirus after returning from a stay in Milan. The following month, the first death was recorded, an 80-year-old woman who also suffered from other pathologies. This was the first of over 14,000 deaths due to coronavirus. In an attempt to contain the virus, the canton of Ticino entered a so-called state of necessity on the 11th of March 2020. 5 days later, the whole of Switzerland followed suit, with a series of restrictions that would not be completely lifted until the 1st of April 2022. On this date, the obligation to wear masks on public transport and the revocation of all remaining COVID restrictions also came to an end. We all surely remember that there was an intense vaccination campaign. In Switzerland, 66% of the population has completed at least the first vaccination series. It has been calculated that the virus and the pandemic have cost Switzerland over 8.3 billion euros. Number 9. Greece. Although there have been more vaccinations in Greece than in Switzerland, the Hellenic nation has recorded a slightly higher rate, 52,400 per 100,000 inhabitants. In fact, Greece has reported a total of 5.6 million cases to the World Health Organization as of the 18th of February 2024. In terms of deaths, these are 363 per 100,000 inhabitants, much higher than the 164 per 100,000 inhabitants in Switzerland. The first case in Greece was recorded on the 26th of February 2020. A 38-year-old woman was found positive for coronavirus after returning from northern Italy. Around 3 weeks later, a 66-year-old man with other pre-existing conditions died, becoming the first Greek victim of COVID-19. Greece has had some of the strictest restrictive measures in Europe. The first lockdown was between the 23rd of March and the 4th of May 2020, although there were other less intense lockdowns after that. According to various sources, there has been a serious problem of lack of hospital staff, which has made things even more difficult. Some newspapers claim that this is also due to the government's choice to avoid hiring new staff, due to the bailout plan of the mid-2010s and also due to the costs that the pandemic has caused Greece. Number 8. Portugal. Portugal has been the European nation with the highest percentage of people vaccinated. 95% of the population has received the first dose of the vaccine, and 87% have completed the first vaccination cycle. 69% of Portuguese people have also received at least one booster dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, but other European nations have done better in this regard. As of February 18, 2024, there have been 273 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in this nation, with a total of 54,800 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. It all started on February 21, 2020, with 2 positive cases who had contracted the virus in Italy and Spain. Since then, there have been more and more cases, leading the government to declare a state of emergency on March 18 of the same year. This hit the Portuguese economy and businesses hard. As early as April, 80% of companies had suffered a significant drop in sales. Only 4% of companies had a turnover growth after the start of the pandemic. The lockdown caused a collapse of the Portuguese economy in the very sectors that were developing the most in the country in those years. In fact, 98% of accommodation and catering services experienced a sharp decline. The European Union has allocated 16.6 billion euros in grants and loans to help this country recover from the pandemic. Number 7. Iceland. Iceland is a land of opposites. It is one of the European countries with the most infections, but at the same time one of the nations with the fewest deaths. As of February 2024, the World Health Organization reports approximately 57,600 infections per 100,000 inhabitants, with 51 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. The first case of infection was recorded on the 20th of February 2020, and it was an Icelandic citizen in quarantine who had just returned from Italy. Of course, a 14-day quarantine was immediately established for those who were sick or who arrived from countries considered to be at risk. Anyone who violated the quarantine risked up to 3 months in prison. To try to contain the virus, on the 23rd of March of the same year, the Icelandic government issued the first restrictive measures, which would then be completely lifted on the 25th of February 2022. In addition, an intensive vaccination campaign was planned. Iceland is one of the countries in Europe with the most people vaccinated. 82% of the population has completed the first vaccination cycle, and 70% have had at least one booster dose, even surpassing Portugal. Iceland has been at the forefront of genetic sequencing of all its positive COVID-19 cases, in order to trace in detail all the variants of the virus present in the country. Number 6. Denmark. Denmark also had a high percentage of people vaccinated, with 82% of the population having completed the first cycle. The first case was confirmed on the 27th of February 2020. It was a Danish journalist returning from a ski holiday in northern Italy. He was the first of 3.4 million people infected in Denmark, corresponding to approximately 59,000 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. In Denmark, COVID-19 has killed or at least contributed to the deaths of 165 people per 100,000 inhabitants. The largest wave of infections and deaths occurred from late November 2021 to mid-May 2022, with a peak in deaths in the first 15 days of March. However, it was during those days that Denmark lifted all restrictive measures against the virus, becoming the first European country to do so. In fact, Denmark was the second country in Europe after Italy to impose a lockdown against the coronavirus, on the 13th of March 2020. However, on the 1st of February 2022, just as infections were soaring, the government decided to withdraw all measures. Only measures for unvaccinated people from non-Schengen area countries remained in force. Number 5. France. It is important to note that the data presented here only applies to mainland France, excluding all French territories outside of continental Europe. France has a global presence, but the World Health Organization has distinguished mainland France from its other territories scattered around the world. In France, there have been proportionally slightly more infections than in Denmark, but significantly more deaths. As of the 18th of February 2024, the World Health Organization has reported nearly 60,000 infections and 258 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, despite similar vaccination rates to Denmark. In fact, in this country as well, 82% of the population has completed the first cycle of vaccinations, and 63% have also received at least one booster dose. The first European case of coronavirus was reported in France. It involved a man who had returned from China and began to show symptoms on the 17th of January 2020. He was officially declared positive for COVID on the 24th of January. The second and third cases were also reported in France, on the same day. However, it wasn't until mid-March that the first restrictions were implemented. On 12th and the 13th of March, the closure of schools, bars, nightclubs and other businesses was announced. The full lockdown began on the 17th of March. Number 4. Luxembourg. Luxembourg detected the first case of COVID-19 on its territory on the 1st of March 2020. This was a man who had traveled to the country from Italy via Belgium. It was the first of over 390,000 cases in this small nation, equivalent to around 62,500 infections per 100,000 inhabitants. However, the mortality rate was relatively low, at 160 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. Luxembourg declared a state of emergency on the 18th of March 2020, although schools had already been closed since the 13th of March. The first Luxembourg lockdown ended at the end of May 2020, when the virus transmission rate reached very low levels. However, there were further tightenings of measures during the second and third waves of infections. There was also an intensive vaccination campaign here, but it led to a vaccination rate slightly lower than the last 4 countries seen so far. In fact, 74% of the population completed the first round of vaccination and 59% received at least one booster dose. Number 3. Slovenia. Out of the 10 nations in this ranking, Slovenia has the highest death rate, 478 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. If you want to know the European country with the highest death rate, watch this video until the end. As of the 18th of February 2024, the World Health Organization reported around 64,700 infections per 100,000 inhabitants, making Slovenia the third European country in terms of percentage of infected people. Slovenia is also the country on this list with the lowest percentage of vaccinated people. In fact, only 58% of the population has completed the first round of vaccination, and only 31% have had at least one booster dose. In the spring of 2020, Slovenia was among the fortunate nations during the first wave of COVID-19, with a relatively low number of cases. This led the government to declare the end of the epidemic in the country in May 2020, the first among European nations. However, the situation quickly reversed during the autumn of the same year, with the second wave overwhelming the country. The number of deaths in relation to the population increased significantly, placing Slovenia among the nations hardest hit by the virus. Number 2. Austria. The first cases of coronavirus in Austria were two 24-year-old Italians living in Innsbruck, who tested positive on the 25th of February 2020. They were the first of over 6 million infections, corresponding to 68,300 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. The total number of deaths directly or indirectly attributed to the virus was 22,500 people, or 253 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. In terms of vaccinations, 75% of the Austrian population has completed at least the first cycle, while 61% have had at least one booster dose. The lockdown in Austria lasted from the 16th of March to the 20th of April 2020, although some restrictions had already begun a few days earlier. Austria spent more than any other European country on coronavirus aid in 2020. In that year alone, €1,475 per person was spent on coronavirus aid, compared to a European Union average of €325. As of August 2022, €46.4 billion had been spent on coronavirus aid, equivalent to around €5,200 per person. Before we reveal number 1, if you found this video interesting and would also like to know the 10 European countries least affected by COVID, we ask you to like it, because when this video reaches 500 likes, we will publish a video on the topic. And if you also decide to subscribe to our channel, you would help us a lot to spread our project. Thank you very much. Number 1. Cyprus. Cyprus holds the record for the European nation with the highest percentage of infections. Cyprus has registered a staggering 76,700 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, making this island one of the worst-hit nations in the entire world. However, the death rate has not been particularly high, with 154 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. The first two cases of coronavirus in Cyprus were confirmed on the 9th of March 2020. They were a 25-year-old man returning from Italy and a 64-year-old man returning from the United Kingdom. To prevent the spread of the virus, the government imposed a lockdown from the 24th of March to the 13th of April 2020, although schools had been closed a few days earlier. In Cyprus, 74% of the population has completed at least the first course of vaccination, and 55% have also received a booster dose. One last interesting fact. A feline variant of the coronavirus has also spread particularly widely in Cyprus, killing around 8,000 cats, as of November 2023. These have been the 10 European countries with the most cases of COVID-19. However, if microstates are also taken into account, Liechtenstein, Andorra and San Marino would also enter the top 10, the latter with 74,500 infections per 100,000 inhabitants. However, the European country with the highest mortality rate is not among the countries in this ranking. This is Bulgaria, which has registered 557 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. However, Bulgaria is not included in this ranking as it has only reported 19,100 infections per 100,000 inhabitants. In terms of vaccinations, only 30% of the population has completed the first course, while only 12% have received the booster dose. Over to you now. What do you think of this ranking? What was the situation like in your country? Share your experience by writing it in the comments. If you like, you can also take a look at other videos on our channel, such as the one on the 10 countries with the worst health in Europe. You will find it in the top right corner. Well, that's all for this video. Have a nice day and see you next time.